Thank you everyone for joining on a Sunday. We're excited about this second day with everyone today. For those that are joining today and weren't here yesterday, just a reminder that this is a joint GYBN, GYBN, and ICCA Consortium orientation sessions on the Convention on Biological Diversity. So yesterday we started with a really action-packed day. We went through some of the key issues on biodiversity at the global level. Melina was kind enough to give us a big picture idea of where we are in terms of biodiversity. I think one of the biggest takeaway messages I had from her presentation was that it's not just about the biodiversity crisis, but about the drivers of that crisis. What are the drivers of biodiversity loss? And so she took us through some key drivers, key issues, consumption, and others on why we are where we are. And that set the stage perfectly for Jing to take us through a presentation on the role that Indigenous people have played and can continue to play in global environmental governance. I know many of us here today are from Indigenous communities or from local communities. And so Jing's presentation was perfect in terms of setting the stage for helping us understand the role that Indigenous peoples can play in the biodiversity. For me, I think one of the biggest takeaways or one of the key issues she brought up was when she presented those maps, the map from Indonesia. And she presented the map of Indonesia and then presented biodiversity hotspots, the protected areas. And then at the very end, layered on Indigenous communities to that. And it was visually very clear how Indigenous people still to this day occupy areas with the highest amount of biodiversity. And many of these are so I think for us, it's really important to keep that in mind as we move forward learning about the convention, because youth, Indigenous peoples, local communities are really the future of where biodiversity is. So that's just a brief recap to put everyone up to date if you weren't able to join yesterday. Stefa, go ahead.
Thank you, Ami, for that recap. And just to situate ourselves again in the 3-day program, we're done with day 1. Now we have 2 more days left. And what's happening today is that we're going to be having a presentation on the CBD, and also like how it works, the nitty-gritty of the CBD. We're gonna have a presentation on how to engage with the CBD. And then we're gonna have a small panel where we hear from the experiences of different people from both youth and those from Indigenous peoples and local communities on how they have engaged with the CBD. And then we break out into discussions. And I think without further ado, let me introduce then our first speaker for today. Today we are being joined by Christian Schwarzer, who is one of the co-founders of the Global Youth Biodiversity Network, and who has been coordinating the network since it began in 2010. And he has helped it to grow into the global movement that it is now. He is our resident CBD expert with very rich experience in participating in the UN negotiations. And he has been teaching about environmental governance at 2 universities. And so without further ado, Christian, like whenever you're ready, you can take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for this very nice introduction, Sefa. Really happy to be here. Happy Valentine's Day to everybody. And before I go into the presentation, I just want to say a big thank you to the interpreters. I apologize if I'm going to speak too fast. I will do my best to speak as slowly as possible. There was one person in the ICCA consortium that once told me there is no revolution without translation. So a big thank you for the people that are making this effort today to have this available in different languages. I have the pleasure today to tell you a little bit about one of my favorite things, the CBD. As Sefa said, I've been teaching about environmental governance for quite a while. But what Sefa didn't mention is that when I started with this almost 15 years ago, it was coming out of a desire that I just wanted to understand how international negotiations are working. I'm not coming from a family of environmentalists. In fact, nobody in my family has ever been working for an environmental organization before. I come from a mid-sized city in the deep west of Germany that is probably one of the most heavily urbanized, most heavily habitat fragmented, and most polluted cities in this part of the world. And whenever I was thinking about biodiversity, it was about the local forest that was sliced in half by a 6-lane highway right next to my parents' place. And I was just wondering, what can we do about this? Should we just look on? Are these people in suits that are attending conferences are deciding over our heads, and is there nothing that we can do? And that one day I just participated in one of these conferences and I had absolutely no clue of what was going on. My English at that point was very bad. I was not feeling very confident to speak up at all. So for the next couple of years, I would just be sitting in a corner, hiding myself, trying not to speak English, and literally writing notes before I was saying anything. And what I want to show you today is that this world of people that are going to these conferences is not as mysterious as it seems. It's actually something very logical, and it's something where everyone has a place, where everybody can make a difference. But whether these conferences have an impact on our daily life, whether they change the status of biodiversity, is something that is also a little bit up to what we make out of them. And I hope that this presentation will be useful for you to understand how the CBD works. I hope I'm not speaking too fast. First, everything that I'm going to present to you, you can also read in my favorite book, because Melina and I wrote it, CBD in a Nutshell. It's our guidebook to the CBD process. You can download it on our website, gybn.org/publications. And I think it's a very nice introduction to how the CBD functions. So if this presentation is too fast, please take a look to this wonderful guidebook. All right, let's get right into it. Let's hope I'm going to keep the time. Why the CBD? Well, after World War II in the 50s and 60s, there was slowly a recognition growing of the importance of addressing environmental issues. Pollution was becoming a huge issue. Environmental destruction became more and more visible, at least in the Western world. And there was an agreement that we need to do something about it, and that no country can solve these problems by itself. Therefore, a number of different environmental agreements have been created. And you can see some examples here. However, the problem with these agreements was that over the years, they became quite a lot. And each of these agreements was only focusing on one single issue. So we have Ramsar, for instance, that was only focusing on wetlands. Or we have CMS that was only focusing on migratory species. But environmental problems are interlinked with each other. So by the 1980s, governments finally realized that we need to bring this together, that we need to streamline environmental governance. And in 1992, this led to the Earth Summit that took place in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. Until then, this was the largest gathering of governments in the world, and it led to the adoption of 3 important multilateral environmental agreements, or the so-called Rio Conventions. And these are the CBD, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, or UNFCCC, the UN Convention to Combat Desertification, or UNCCD. So this is very important to keep in mind. These 3 conventions came out of the Earth Summit and are being referred to as the Rio Conventions. And they have a lot in common, because for the first time they were looking at environmental issues from a more holistic perspective. Well, but for today, we will just focus on the CBD. I will go deeper into how the CBD functions in a few moments. But what is important to understand is that the CBD is guided by 3 overarching objectives: the conservation of biological diversity, the sustainable use of biodiversity, and these 2 are quite easy to understand. The third one is a bit more complicated, and that is to ensure the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from the use of genetic resources. Basically, what this third objective means is that the international community will establish rules for the access to and the fair sharing of benefits, be it monetary or non-monetary benefits, of the use of genetic resources. For instance, if a company goes to, let's say, South Africa and uses traditional knowledge of an indigenous tribe or uses any genetic resource from this country to produce a medicine, then in an ideal world, this objective of the CBD would require this company or this government to share the proceeds of this medicine with the tribe, with the country where these resources were taken from. Important in an ideal world. I will talk about this a little bit later. All right, who are the parties to the CBD? And this is also important to understand. Parties in international law means governments that have signed and ratified an agreement. Signing is like the first step, where the president or a representative of the government merely expresses their willingness to bring it into force. And then the second step is the ratification, which means that an international agreement is being transformed into national legislation. So there are these two steps that are important. Every party that joins the CBD has a couple of legal requirements that they need to fulfill. The most important one is that every government that becomes a party to the CBD cannot act against the convention. However, there is a lot of room for interpretation. Second, every government that joins the CBD is legally required to create a national biodiversity action plan. I will talk about this in a few moments. Governments are also required to report about what they are doing to protect biodiversity, and they need to create a national focal point. So a person that is the contact person for everything related to biodiversity and the implementation of the CBD in the country. These are just a few requirements. There are some more, and you can already see these are not super strict requirements. Like there is no requirement that a party to the CBD has to protect X percentage of the national territory. This is not what becoming a party to the CBD means. It's a set of rules, but it's very open. It's very simple. And as you can see here on the map, literally every country in the world has joined the CBD, which makes the convention quite powerful. There are two exceptions. There is the Vatican, for the simple reason because the Vatican has a policy that they remain neutral in international politics and in general don't join international conventions. And then there is the US, which is a bit odd and which could be a topic for another seminar. But basically what happened was political disagreements within the US government, and they never ratified the CBD. My personal perspective on this is that this is one of the greatest success factors of the CBD, because unfortunately, if we would have the CBD on board in the CBD, things would probably get much more complicated. But that's also a story for another day. All right, so let's summarize until here. Why is the CBD important when there are only such few commitments for governments? First, because after all these decades of human destruction of nature that went unpunished, the CBD constitutes the first time that all governments in the world said, we are uniting to prevent the loss of biodiversity. We are working together and we don't want to continue business as usual, and we want to create a structure to protect our basis of life. This is what the CBD in its text enshrines. This is very important, and from a human development point of view, this is a very big step forward. However, we should not forget these are just words, and words can be meaningless if they don't follow action. So we have to be a little bit critical with that. All right, then the CBD is important because it gives this mandate to governments to address biodiversity. Because before there was no global structure that governments could refer to when they were working on biodiversity issues. The third point is also very important. Before the CBD existed, there was no global platform where governments could come together and collaborate on biodiversity issues. This only changed with the CBD. There were a couple of previous platforms like IUCN, for instance, that had.
Christian, I'm
Yes.
sorry. Can you speak a little bit slower because it's quite a tough subject, and it will be easier for interpreters to interpret.
Okay, I will do my best to speak more slowly.
Okay.
So this platform that the CBD created was very important because it enabled governments to come together and to find ways to collaborate with each other. The other point why I think the CBD is important is because it finally started to create global standards on how biodiversity should be protected, what needs to be taken into account when we protect biodiversity. So this global standard setting is also very important, and I feel this is something where the CBD has really positively changed things. Now, how is the CBD being implemented? The CBD is a global convention that focuses on global target setting, and it has a set of global obligations that every member state has to fulfill. Once the CBD has agreed on global targets, every party to the CBD is required to implement this on the national level. And they're usually doing this through national biodiversity strategies and action plans, so-called MBSUBs. And we're going to talk about this in a moment. What are MBSUBs? So national biodiversity strategies and action plans can come in all forms and shapes. They're planning instruments. So they can come as a piece of legislation, they can come as a conservation initiative, but what is important is that they establish concrete targets and actions for the protection of biodiversity on the national level. And as I mentioned before, every party to the CBD is legally required to develop such national biodiversity strategies and action plans. Here are some examples of what an MBSUB is. South Africa, for instance, has a very ambitious one. It was adopted in 2015. It is valid until 2015. And as you can see, it has 114 concrete and measurable actions. One of these actions is, for instance, that the government commits to developing and funding a fund for national biodiversity communication, education, and awareness strategies. And it also commits that at least 40% of all universities in South Africa include biodiversity into the curriculum of these programs. Another MBSUB that I wanted to show you, just because I'm quite familiar with it, is the German MBSUB. The German MBSUB, for instance, has a goal that 2% of the land area in Germany should be pristine nature, that should be free of any human intervention. There is a goal to ensure that 25% of all kindergartens offer some nature experience sessions where kids go out and experience nature. There is also a goal that says that by 2015, 75% of the population should consider biodiversity conservation as a societal priority. So basically, MBSUBs are sets of goals. What I also mentioned before is that governments are legally required to report about what they're doing to protect biodiversity. And this is helpful because it allows us to do a global monitoring of how close we are to achieving our goals on the international level. However, we need to be critical of that because it's governments self-reporting about their activities. And sometimes governments are not covering everything, or sometimes the frameworks for this reporting are not good enough to cover everything that is relevant. So it's important that we heard yesterday, for instance, about the local biodiversity outlook, that we also do our own reporting and make sure that the contributions by civil society, by IPLCs, by youth are also being taken into account. Well, a little bit about the convention text itself. I don't want to go too much into the legal nitty-gritty, but what is important to understand is that the CBD is not very detailed. You can download the text on the CBD website. It is actually quite short, and it does not go into any specific goals or action plans. What the CBD does is that it creates some institutional arrangements we're going to talk about in a few moments. And it is a framework that everybody can use to then adopt more concrete and more detailed action programs. However, how we fill this frame that the CBD is giving us is up to every party. And that's also the biggest weakness. If parties are proactive, if they want to turn the CBD into a strong framework for action, they can do that. If they are not interested in that, then the CBD remains weak. There are also 7 thematic programs of work in the CBD that are focusing on specific areas. You can see a little bit of an overview here. Furthermore, there are cross-cutting issues that the CBD is focusing on. And you can also get an overview here of the cross-cutting issues that the CBD has identified and that it tries to focus on. I mentioned before, the CBD creates what we call an institutional framework. This sounds horribly complicated, but it's actually much easier than it looks like here. The highest decision-making body of the CBD is the so-called Conference of the Parties, or COP. The Conference of the Parties is a meeting that takes place roughly every 2 years, where representatives of all the governments in the world, but also civil society, indigenous people, youth, women, can come together, and where government representatives adopt more detailed guidance on how the CBD should be implemented. What more detailed guidance means is what we're going to discuss in a few moments. Then we have 2 so-called subsidiary bodies. Subsidiary bodies are permanent bodies that have been established in order to provide advice and to help prepare for the Conference of the Parties. At the moment, we have 2 subsidiary bodies in the CBD. There is SABSTA, the subsidiary body on scientific, technical, and technological advice. And this is a body that mostly focuses on providing scientific and technical guidance for the COP. So they would do scientific assessments, look into indicators for how we can measure progress towards a goal. They would look into baselines. They would try to identify new and emerging issues that are important for the COP to consider. And then we have SBI, the subsidiary body on implementation. This was only recently created in 2014, and SBI focuses more on, as the name suggests, implementation. What are the obstacles that are holding us back from implementing the CBD? How can we overcome these obstacles? What resources do we need and how can we mobilize them? It focuses on capacity building, but also on aspects related to transparency. And while a lot of focus is usually being given to the COP, these 2 bodies are also very, very important. And if you're a bit confused, what SABSTA is focusing on is basically the what we have to do, and the SBI is more focused on how we can implement the CBD, on how we can do it. And for this slide, I would like to hand over to Sefa for a moment. Sefa, maybe you can explain a little bit the working group in Article 8J.
Sure, I'll try my best. So aside from the subsidiary bodies, the COP can also establish other groups composed of the same like governments based on topics that they think are kind of necessary. And so one of these working groups is the working group on Article 8J, related provisions. So this is not the best name for it, but what Article 8J is referring to is an article in the text of the CBD, and you can read it here, that says that each party shall respect, preserve, and maintain knowledge, innovations, and practices of indigenous peoples and local communities embodying traditional lifestyles relevant for the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. So essentially, it's the article that refers to traditional knowledge. And so, and there are other articles that are related to this topic, and these are what's referred to by related provisions. Okay. So just to give a few achievements, for instance, of this working group, it has established a program of work on how to implement this. It has developed some guidelines and other tools that can be used, for instance, to ensure that there's free, prior, and informed consent, like guidelines to ensure free, prior, and informed consent is being followed, and on social impact assessments, for instance. There has been a plan of action on customary sustainable use by communities, and there is now also a funding mechanism which facilitates the participation of indigenous peoples and local communities in the CBD meetings. So yeah, Christian, back to you.
Super. Thank you so much, Sefa, for this introduction. I will try to speak a little bit more slowly. I hope I'm going to be successful in this. I already introduced you a little bit to the COP, the Conference of the Parties, the SUBSTA, the subsidiary body on scientific, technical, and technological advice, which focuses on providing scientific advice to the CBD, the SBI, the subsidiary body on implementation, which focuses on how we can overcome obstacles for implementation. Sefa just gave you a wonderful introduction to the working group on Article 8J on traditional knowledge, but there are two more important bodies to the CBD that you should be aware of, and these are protocols. As I mentioned to you before, the CBD convention text itself is very general. It doesn't go into details. It just has a number of paragraphs that present some fundamental standards that every government agrees on. However, when we want to take a decision that is also legally binding and that goes beyond this very general convention text, then what the CBD is required to do is that they adopt protocols. Protocols are themselves also legally binding, and they need to be ratified separately. So that means that we have a number of countries that are a party to the CBD, but not all of them are also a party to the protocols because they have to ratify them separately. The two protocols that the CBD has adopted so far are the Cartagena Protocol on biosafety, which focuses on risks that could be posed by living modified organisms, as well as biotechnology. And then we have the Nagoya Protocol on access and benefit sharing, which was adopted in 2010. And it was only then that we had an instrument to achieve the third objective of the CBD, which, as I mentioned at the beginning, focuses on access and benefit sharing of genetic resources. I'm not going to go into detail with these two protocols, but what is important to understand is that protocols are separate legal instruments that need to be ratified separately and that extend the scope of the CBD. Okay, I hope this is clear, and I hope I'm not speaking too fast. Another purely, at least in theory, purely administrative body of the convention that I just want to mention is the Secretariat. The Secretariat is an organization that is based in Montreal in Canada that has around 100 to 150 employees that administrates the CBD. So what they're doing is to organize meetings, they prepare all the documents, all the reports, they provide help to member states in the implementation of the CBD, and they also coordinate with other organizations. So it's a very important part of the convention, but at least in theory, it's not supposed to be a political body. It's not a decision-making body. It is purely administrating the works of the convention. Then we have IPBES, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. IPBES is an independent UN, no, not UN, it's an independent agency that is not part of the CBD. It was only created in 2012. And while it is not part of the CBD, it is closely associated with the CBD, and it provides assessments on the state of biodiversity. Some of you might remember the big 2019 Global Biodiversity Assessment. And IPBES is an incredibly important tool for the CBD because it brings together the science community and it helps us to get better and more independent scientific advice on the status of biodiversity. And then in an ideal world, the scientific information that IPBES prepares would then help the CBD to develop concrete policies to implement what the science is telling us we need to do. Okay, so we have now spoken about this institutional framework of the CBD, the SBSTA, the SPI, the COP, the Article 8J, IPBES, the Secretariat. But how are all these different international bodies working together to take decisions? What you can see here on this slide is roughly a timeline. It's a little bit outdated, but this is basically how the CBD still operates. Every 2 years, we have a conference of the parties where all the member states are coming together. Before the COP can meet, there are usually 2 preparatory meetings. Every year, there is a meeting of the SBSTA, the Subsidiary Body for Scientific, Technical, and Technological Advice that I presented to you before. The SBI, the Subsidiary Body for Implementation, is only meeting every 2 years. So these 2 years between the COP are being referred to as the intersessional period. And this is not a period where we just chill and relax and wait until COP happens. This is the period where we are preparing new decisions, where we are discussing how decisions from the COP are going to be implemented. So the CBD is a constant process. And while a lot of attention is being given to the COP is only the moment when the final decisions are being adopted. I would say that around 80 to 95% of the content is being prepared in these 2 years before, during meetings of working groups and of SBI and SBSTA. All right, let's look into this in a little bit more detail. How are decisions being taken in the CBD? There are conference of the parties, and at the conference of the parties, governments usually agree on a multi-year program of work. And this multi-year program of work contains a number of issues that governments want to create decisions on. Once the COP has finished its meeting, and once this multi-year program of work has been adopted, the CBD Secretariat will start to send out emails. We call these emails notifications. These notifications are being sent to all member states of the CBD, as well as civil society and other groups. And these notifications usually request information and perspectives on specific issues. So for instance, the CBD could ask all the parties, what are your perspectives on protected areas, or more specifically on how connectivity between protected areas could be improved. And then based on the responses to these emails, based on the positions that not only member states, but also civil society groups are submitting, the CBD Secretariat would then develop draft negotiating text. These negotiating texts will then be presented online. Everybody can comment on them. And then a more finalized version will be presented at SAPSTA, SBI, and the different working groups meetings. These different bodies will then meet for about 1 week, and government representatives will negotiate about these text documents. And once they have agreed on a text, it will be adopted as a so-called recommendation. The recommendation would then go to COP, and around 90% of all the texts that SAPSTA and SBI have prepared will just be adopted by COP. There is not going to be a big negotiation. They will just adopt it because most issues are not so controversial. But then there are the other 10% of the documents where SAPSTA could not agree on a final recommendation. And these are the texts that will then be negotiated during the 2 weeks of the COP. You can already see this is a very time-consuming process. We don't always agree on the best decisions, because the challenge here is that all these documents need to be adopted by consensus. Every party to the CBD, all 195 member states, need to agree on these decisions. So this means that we only arrive at the smallest common denominator, but it also ensures that all the different interests of the parties are being reflected, at least in an ideal world. In practice, there are some governments that have more power, more influence, more money than others, and you can also see this in the negotiating text. And you remember at the beginning, I said that I'm personally thinking that one of the success factors of the CBD is that the US is not on board. And that is precisely the reason. If the US would be on board, you would have another government that is very powerful, very influential, that has a lot of money, and that would make the negotiations much more complicated. On the other hand, not having the US on board means that all the decisions we're taking in the CBD are not valid to the US. I'm not going to go into all details of how these negotiations are working, but what I just wanted to mention to you is that it's not usually one country that negotiates. Usually the negotiations are taking place in groups. So you have different countries that are forming negotiating blocks. We have, for instance, the European Union that usually negotiates together. We have the African group. We have GRULAC, the group of all Latin American and Caribbean countries that coordinate their positions beforehand. Sometimes we have the G77 and China, so all developing countries speaking together. There is JUSCANS, which normally consists of Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and Japan that are coordinating their positions. So if you want to do advocacy work in the CBD, it is important to keep in mind that you have these negotiating groups, and that it's very important to understand to which group a country usually belongs to. And that will also help you to understand how influential a country is in these negotiations. All right, I talked a lot about what governments can do in the process, but what about civil society? I have participated in different conventions, and I can say that the CBD is one of the most civil society friendly conventions that are out there. There are almost no meetings that are close to civil society. We can participate in almost every meeting in the CBD that is taking place. That is very different, for instance, in the climate convention, where I think now up to 50% of all the meetings are taking place behind closed doors. Of course, we also have meetings behind closed doors in the CBD. A lot of the final decisions are being taken behind closed doors, but still it's very rare that a negotiating session is close to civil society. As civil society, we can deliver statements during the sessions. We can also organize side events, which can be very important to share information, to help that the experience, the knowledge that we have from the ground is being reflected when decisions are being taken. We can also organize meetings with governments, but we have no voting rights. So the decisions are being taken exclusively by governments. But we can be there, we can listen, we can talk to them, we can remind them, and we can push them to be more ambitious. So we don't have all the tools, but we have a lot of tools that we can use to create positive change in the CBD. Just a little check with the interpreters. Is it slow enough or should I slow down further? I'll take that as a yes, and I'm noticing that I'm running out of time. So I'll try to be a bit more quick with the remaining slides while speaking slowly. All right, so we have talked about the institutional framework of the CBD. We have talked about the different negotiating groups, what civil society can do, but what is actually being adopted at CBD meetings? Usually they adopt what we call COP decisions, which are individual legal texts that focus on specific issues. But roughly every 10 years, the CBD adopts a so-called strategic plan that usually covers a period of 10 years. What you can see here is the previous strategic plan that was adopted in 2010. It consists of 5 strategic goals that you can see here on the side and 20 targets, the so-called Aichi targets. When we adopted these targets, we all celebrated this as a huge win for biodiversity. However, 10 years later, and when we compare the achievement of the targets, it looks very different. And you can see here that there are very few targets that we have actually achieved. And this is quite disappointed after all the efforts, all the resources that have been invested into this. So why are we failing with achieving targets in the CBD? There are a number of reasons. A lot of the decisions in the CBD are being taken in a top-down approach. And there is very little that comes from the ground. There's very little understanding of the people that negotiate in the CBD. What are the challenges that people that work on the local level are experiencing? Another problem is that the Aichi targets did not address sufficiently indirect drivers, or what we refer to as changes in consumption and production patterns. Another big issue is that we had adopted all these beautiful targets, but we did not provide enough resources to implement them. There was simply not enough money. Political will is also a big issue. Governments love to attend big conferences to make big promises, but when it comes to implementing these promises, when it comes to spending many years on pushing, political ambition often goes away very quickly. So it's important that we constantly push and that we don't allow governments to just make these promises and then don't do anything. When I prepared the presentation, Sefa told me this is my favorite slide, which is true, is the money. I mentioned it already. When the strategy was adopted, there was an estimate that we would need up to 120 billion US dollars to implement all the Aichi biodiversity targets. 120 billion. That sounds like a lot of money, but first, if it's over 10 years, that means 12 billion per year. And if you just look at the numbers that I'm showing you here, then this is tiny, tiny compared to the other amounts that are being spent. I don't have the latest numbers on all the COVID stimulus packages that have been adopted in the global north, but I heard it is more than 11 trillion US dollars, 11 trillion that could be mobilized within less than a year to save our economies from the impact of COVID. So if we can mobilize 11 trillion, why is it so difficult to mobilize 12 billion US dollars per year to protect biodiversity? Where are we now? I realize I'm going over time. I'll try to keep this as short as possible. There are only a few slides left, so please bear with me. We are now in the process of adopting a new 10-year framework of action for the CBD. And we are calling this the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. So you have seen we have failed quite miserably with the last 10-year framework of action for the CBD. And what are we doing now? We're just adopting the next one. And it's not wrong to do this. But what is currently not happening in the CBD is a deep reflection about implementation, about how we can make sure that we don't take decisions from the top down, but that we make sure that it's a bottom-up process, that everybody is empowered in this process. So this conversation about implementation is what we absolutely need to have. But right now, the focus is on defining new goals and targets for biodiversity for the period until 2030 and 2050. And this was supposed to be adopted at COP15 last year in October, but then COVID happened and we're currently not sure when COP15 is finally going to take place. Can be in October, can be next year, we're not sure. What is important to understand about the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework is that it's not only going to be a framework that will apply to the CBD, but to the whole of the UN system. Okay, and I'm seeing I have to speed up a little bit more, so I'm just going to skip over it. Just some challenges that I want to mention. This is the second last slide. So what we need to do in the CBD is a stronger focus on bottom-up approaches. There's also usually a gap between ambition and resources. I already mentioned it. The CBD is much better than many other conventions when it comes to taking decisions, but implementation is the big problem. Another problem that we have is that a lot of new and emerging issues are going into the CBD, like synthetic biology, and that the traditional conservation community doesn't understand these, doesn't know how to deal with these, and we have a big disconnect between these communities. And another point that I just want to mention is that we have a big divide between big conservation NGOs like Conservation International, WWF, IUCN, TNC, and small organizations and IPLCs. This is very important to understand. And my very last slide, what I find most disappointing about the world in 2021 is that we still have a massive north-south divide. And you can see this in the CBD. You can see here on the map, the countries that have the resources, that have the money, are those that are predominantly in the global north. But the countries that have the most biodiversity are those in the south. So it is important that global north and global south work together, have dialogues with each other, understand each other. But what we're seeing in our world today is that we have more division. And this inequity that these two maps are showing you is actually what is really driving biodiversity loss. So overcoming this inequality needs to be at the heart of post-2020, needs to be at the heart of every biodiversity policy in the north and the south. Thank you so much for your patience. And now I think we have a bit of time for questions.
Thank you so much, Christian, for that presentation. It was very informative, and I hope it built
Gracias,
a lot
Christian, por la presentación.
Oh, sorry, Ame. You're out of the interpretation room?
Got it. Thanks, Stefa.
Yes. So yeah, again, thank you, Christian. I think everyone learned a lot and it built a lot of understanding of how the CBD works. So we have a question in the chat. It's from Aquilas. And the question is there any sanction for governments who fail to or willingly do not implement their commitments to the CBD?
This is a brilliant question. Thank you so much for this. No, there are no sanctions. Because for sanctions to exist in the CBD, every government would have to agree that we're going to create a system of sanctions and punishment. And no government is going to do this. So unfortunately, we don't have this, but that doesn't mean that the CBD is teethless. If we want governments to implement the decisions that have been taken under the CBD, we have to make sure that no politician can just shy away from it. We need to make sure that biodiversity is something that voters care about and that politicians need to care about if they want to get reelected. So we have no sanctions in the CBD, but we ourselves can build the movement, can build the pressure to make sure that our politicians, our leaders are being held accountable. And of course, there are big differences as to how you can do this. I'm speaking here with a global north perspective, where we are allowed to organize demonstrations, at least when there is no COVID. Many countries don't have this luxury. In many countries, if you go out on the street and you protest against the violation of CBD legislation, if you protest against the construction of a dam or something, you can get shot or killed. Melina presented about this yesterday. So there are a lot of inequalities that we have to understand, but unfortunately, there are no legally binding sanctions in the CBD.
Thank you, Christian. And I see that there are a lot. A reminder to please mute yourself when you're not speaking. Thank you so much. There are a lot of questions in the chat, Christian, but I think we might only have time for maybe one more, and then after that you can try to answer them in the chat if that's okay. Let me see which one to take. So let me see. Okay, maybe this one. I'll take this one from Rifa. Have there been instances where parties couldn't come to a consensus decision, and what would happen then?
Yes, there have been many instances. The best example is the voting system in the CBD. The CBD would not be required to take all decisions by consensus. Governments could simply decide to vote and then the majority would decide. But since governments could never agree on this, since they could never find consensus to create a voting system, we're stuck with a consensus-based system. That's the most prominent example. But normally what happens if governments cannot find consensus is that they will negotiate for as long as they find some compromise. And compromise in that sense means that they will water down until they get to a point where everybody can agree to it. So for instance, on resource mobilization, we usually have big fights because countries from the south rightfully want governments in the north to commit to, let's say, $10 billion per year for biodiversity conservation. But then governments in the north don't want to agree to that. Some even can, because it's legally very difficult to commit to such a number without parliament. And then you're going to negotiate until you find a formulation that everybody can agree to. So for instance, the formulation that we found for resource mobilization is that there will be a doubling of the resources, that there will be reliable provision of resources from developed countries to developing countries, but they didn't give any numbers, and they also didn't say a doubling of what is the baseline for that. So that's the trick that they're usually using.
Thank you, Christian. I don't know, maybe Mario, you can advise me if there's time for maybe one more.
Yeah,
Okay.
we should, because everybody has the same question.
Okay.
The one on the gap.
Okay. Just one more then. I'm really sorry that there are a lot of really great questions in the chat, but we might not have time to get through all of them, and they are very important questions. Um, this one then I'll take. Can you explain a bit more between the gap between big NGOs and small NGOs? At like what points do they disagree on?
Oh, wow. Wow. I can give you one example. And whatever example I'm going to give you is not going to valid for all big NGOs or all small NGOs. Let's talk about protected areas. We have a lot of big NGOs that have a lot of money, and a lot of this money is coming from donations. And a lot what big NGOs are doing with this money is to manage protected areas, or they just create protected areas. Small NGOs don't have these resources. Small NGOs focus more on community managed protected areas. I'm not saying that big NGOs are never doing this, but just to give an example. So big NGOs are very interested in making sure that they still have this donor basis, and that, for instance, protected areas can be further expanded, but they don't necessarily care about the people that are living in protected areas. And again, I'm generalizing here. This is not valid for everybody. This is just an example. So big NGOs are caring more about these big conservation issues when it comes to creating big protected areas, but not focusing so much on what we can do with smaller contributions, what communities can contribute. I hope that helps.
Maybe I can complement just for a second. So there are many challenges, as Christian said, but like traditionally, like those funds, like that goes to big organizations, they are tied to very specific commitments. So the more funds you receive from diverse donors, be it governments or private sector or like philanthropies, there is going to be an agenda, and there are going to be some interests that can be vested or not, or they can be in the open. And so these bigger NGOs, they are going to be more tied to those vested interests or to those other interests. Also, like they have to operate very big staff numbers. So it means that they need big amount of money to cover for all those staff expenditures. Whereas like smaller NGOs, they are not tied in that way financially to all the sort of like different or vested or like playing interests, and they are focusing more on very local issues. So like they have more ties to the community, they have more understanding of that, they have like more their priorities more aligned with that. And then also bigger NGOs, they are global, so it's difficult for them to focus specifically on like local issues. They have local offices and so on, but it's much more difficult to like manage all of this at the global level. So the kind of like the power that they have, in a way they have more power, but they can influence less on those critical issues that goes against certain interests. Okay, so it's a very kind of complicated dynamics. My advice to you guys is always to follow the money, where the money comes from, because that will tell you where the interest and what interests like those groups of interest or stakeholders are defending or they are liable to. Okay, so like maybe that's a way that we can start sifting through it. But now, how to close that gap? Like first, like we need to start having more dialogues, and like also there is a tendency for bigger organizations and also from like organizations that are based in global north countries, that they come with the idea that they know how to do conservation better than other people because they have the expertise, the technical expertise. And it's only very recently that this view of like who has the technical expertise or who has the knowledge like is changing. So now we are starting to integrate more a diverse knowledge system, right? We are not only talking about expertise or technical expertise anymore. We are talking about different knowledge systems and different knowledge packages. And so a lot of people now recognize that Indigenous people, local communities, young people, like practitioners, they may know much better than technical expertise from abroad how to manage their own lands, how to integrate their communities into it. So now the situation is changing, okay? But it's still like it's kind of like still common practice that most of these big NGOs come like with this technical expertise from abroad and then try to like impose in many ways their views and their way of conserving. So we really need to create more dialogue. We need to start pushing and loving those NGOs, those big NGOs, also to start like talking about the environment in a more integrated way that considers issues like equity, justice, and so on into their conservation plans, because also that was not how they were operating before, because before it was pretty much separated between natural sciences and social sciences. Okay, I hope I helped a little bit.
Okay, thank you, Melina and Christian, for answering that question. And there are a lot more questions in the chat. I'm really, really sorry, but we'll try to move on with the program and see if there's time at some point to answer more of them. So next up, we have Ameyali, who is going to be giving a presentation, a related presentation on how civil society engages with the CBD. I think Ameyali, whenever you're ready, you can go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Sefa. Gracias.
Oh, I'm so sorry for not, maybe you can just introduce yourself.
I think everybody knows me by now, but I'll do a quick introduction. But before I do that, I think if you were like me, you just sat through a really thrilling presentation by Christian, and my brain is just a little bit feeling like, wow, there's a lot of information there. So if you can, just stretch your arms, get up, move around, do a turn, dance, cough, whatever it is. We had great music from Setha, so let's just kind of shift our brains a little bit so we can refocus. Yeah, take a moment. I see some dancing. Great, wonderful. And thank you to the interpreters. I know it's not easy, and whoever said there is no revolution without interpretation is absolutely correct. So that is definitely understanding each other, I think, is the basis for any work we do together. So I am Ameyali Ramos. I'm from Southern Mexico. I'm here as the International Policy Coordinator for the ICCA Consortium. For those of you who were not here yesterday, the ICCA Consortium is a member-based organization. And we have members all over the world, and our primary members are Indigenous peoples and local communities. So we come from that very unique perspective. Right now, I am going to follow up on Christian's wonderful presentation to kind of help us as youth, as Indigenous people, as women, as local community, as human beings, as an individual, understand, okay, where do I fit into all of this process of the CBD? So that's what my presentation will be about. I notice there are some hands up and there are more questions in the chat. Feel free to keep putting all of the questions that occur to you in the chat. If we don't answer them right away, we will compile them and circulate a question and answer document after the session. So definitely put your questions there. So I'm just going to start sharing my screen here so we can move on with the presentation. Just one moment. Oh, sorry, just not allowing me to share the screen now. So just 1 second. Okay, let's hope this works now. Everyone can see it. Thanks for the
Mhm.
thumbs up, Sefa. Let me just wait until it gets into full. Did it open into the full mode, or can you still only see part of it, Sefa?
We can only still see part of it.
Yeah. 1 second. Okay. That better now? Great. So as I said, my job here today is to help us understand how we, or I, can participate and engage with the CBD. So as Christian very kindly situated, the CBD is huge. Once you understand its different parts, then it doesn't become quite as confusing. But if you've ever been to a CBD meeting, it's still huge. In Nagoya, I think there were above 20,000 people there. And if you go to the website, they have all of these links, all of these parts to it that make it navigating the process seem a lot more confusing than it actually is. So I'm here to try and help us figure out how we can participate. I've decided to split this up. There are very many ways to participate in the CBD and in environment issues, but I've decided to focus on 3 for the purpose of this presentation. The first one, which is where everybody usually goes to when they think of the CBD, is the Conference of the Parties. So we'll go into a little bit of how do I participate in one of these big meetings, one of these Conference of the Parties, these COPs. The second part we'll look at is an intersessional participation. So as Christian said, the COPs really happen only every 2 years. So what happens in between, and can I participate in those in-between moments? And the third one, which for me is the most exciting actually, and a lot of my work gets focused on, is how do I participate at my local, national, and regional level? And how does my participation at that level trickle all the way up, or trickle down? So the Conference of the Parties, as Christian said, these happen every 2 years. And I think one really interesting part of the COP is that it's not just a negotiation meeting. Prior to the COP, there are events, usually side events, or even during the COP, there's side events on all kinds of issues. And civil society, indigenous people, NGOs, big NGOs, governments, everybody can come together and suggest side events. So that's one way that some people participate in the COP, is through these side events, where they say, you know, for us, a big issue is land tenure. So let's talk about land tenure and biodiversity. And they bring stakeholders together and put a side event on that topic. As Christian said, civil society does have, the CBD does have an open doors approach to civil society, but civil society does not have voting rights. Civil society, indigenous people and youth and women and NGOs attend as observers. What does this mean? It means that you can observe, you can listen, you can speak to all the parties, you can be present, you can participate in side events. But when it comes to the actual negotiating and voting, it's something that we're not directly granted access to. So there are no voting rights. Having said this, if you've ever attended a COP, and we'll hear from some folks who have in the past, a lot of what happens and a lot of the negotiations don't actually happen on the negotiation floor. When you're there, the countries are human beings that you can talk to. So you can take your issue, you know, if your particular priority is on agriculture, you can look at what different parties are doing and say, well, you know, I'll speak to Mexico because Mexico has been doing a lot of work on agriculture. And so you find the Mexican representative and you say, dear Ezequiel, you know, in this case, I am really interested in these topics on agriculture, and he might be open to a conversation. And your conversation with him might actually lead him to change his negotiation stance on certain issues. So the opportunity to have access to these actual human beings who are the parties, the governments, is a big deal. And attending these conferences sometimes is worthwhile just for that, to be able to speak to these government representatives in person. So a lot of lobbying and advocacy happens at the CBD, at the COPs, which are really important aspects to negotiations. There's also a huge amount of knowledge transfer. So just like I was saying that there's side events at these COPs, there are also opportunities for you to meet new people, to hear new ideas, to reshape your own priorities and experiences. And so the knowledge aspect of being at one of these meetings is really worthwhile. Again, it's important to re-highlight the importance of partnerships and networks. When you go to these big COP meetings, all of a sudden, at times you find that you aren't alone, that there are other Indigenous peoples or youth or women or NGOs or governments that are out there sharing your perspective and priorities. And so being able to form these partnerships and follow up on them is a really important aspect of participating in the COPs. And being able to be there in person and have these human interactions sometimes goes a long way in terms of having a success at lobbying and advocacy. Another thing that happens that's of interest, especially to a lot of smaller NGOs and youth, is fundraising. So at these COPs, there are a lot of funders that attend. They attend to hear about the issues, to learn about the issues, and also to have a say in what happens at what comes out in the actual agreements. And so being able to meet funders there is also a huge opportunity and worthwhile going. At times you strike up a conversation with someone who happens to know someone who works for Swed Bio or GIZ or the Christensen Fund or more foundations, and that's really interesting for a person, as an individual, as a community member, as a youth, as a woman, to attend. And finally, visibility and outreach. There exist a lot of opportunities during these meetings for visibility, for you to propose topics, for you to engage in the different caucuses, which I'll get into a little bit later, and say, we are coming from this region and these are some of the issues that we're facing in our region. And sharing that, being able to give visibility to the topics that you consider important is essential. So, of course, attending these meetings is not just about showing up. So we'll talk about the intersessional period before then. But for attending these meetings, I think it's really important to remember these three things. One of them is, why are you going? To have a very clear understanding of why am I, as an individual or a community representative or a youth or an IPLC, attending this meeting. Having that clear aim really helps you strategize. These meetings, as I said, are usually huge. And sometimes the side events, there are 200 side events at the same time. And there are 4 different discussions and there are 5 different caucus meetings. And I mean, there's constantly things that you can engage in. But if you have a very clear aim of why you're attending, then you're able to clearly strategize in terms of which ones I'm going to attend, why am I going to attend them, who am I going to prioritize speaking to. So that is really essential in order to be successful at the CBD. Another thing is prepare in advance. I think Christian mentioned in his presentation that negotiations don't usually happen individually by governments. They happen in blocks. And statements don't usually happen individually again. They happen by caucuses or by parties or by groups of people. And so really understand the different players, understand which ones share your perspective or your priorities, and strategize about how you will engage with them. So for instance, as a youth, you might be there as part of GYBN, the Global Youth Biodiversity Network. But you might not just be a youth, you might be a youth and an Indigenous person like CEFA. And so you would participate in GYBN and the IFB, and also meetings of, if you were someone from Latin America, GRULAC, the group on Latin America. So being able to prepare in advance, I think, is really important in terms of understanding the different players and how it all plays out. Sorry, I just slowed down. And then the final thing to remember that is important is to use existing resources and networks. So there are a lot of people that participate in these meetings already that have done a lot of groundwork. Identify them, use those resources, understand what it is, and from there, you can strategize about how you will participate. So let's see here. Again, I think we shared this link already, but I think one of the most useful documents that exist on demystifying the CBD is this biodiversity in a nutshell. That was well done, youth. It's funny because for us who attend these COP meetings, we're always very in awe of how well organized and well prepared youth are at these meetings. So we're learning a lot from this upcoming generation. So if you have questions about the CBD, make sure you take a look at this CBD in a nutshell. It's available there, and I think the link was also shared in the chat. All right. So as Christian said, the COPs, the Conference of the Parties, really are the end points. If you imagine a sandwich, it's kind of the bread of the sandwich, you know? There's a COP meeting and then there's another COP meeting. But the really yummy part of the sandwich is what happens in between the bread. And this is called the intersessional period. So how can I, as a person, participate during this in this sandwich and, you know, the yummy part of the sandwich? And there are tons of ways. So depending on your interests and your expertise and your time, because this takes a lot of time, you could choose to participate in one of the subsidiary bodies that Christian mentioned. So if you're a scientist, for instance, or you have a specific interest in targets and indicators and the nitty-gritty of what we should be doing, the subsidiary bodies are where you should participate. This is Substack, which we'll talk a lot more about tomorrow, so don't worry, and SBI, which is the implementation part of it. In these subsidiary bodies, there are a lot of stakeholders beyond governments that participate, and I'll talk more about these later, but there are 4 main ones in the CBD. One of them is the youth, GYBN, the Global Youth Biodiversity Network. Another one is the IAFB, the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity. Another one is the Women's Caucus. And another one is the CBD Alliance, which is kind of an alliance of civil society and NGOs. The really interesting part, yes?
Excuse me, can you speak a little bit slower, please?
Yes, I saw that. I'll speak even slower. Okay, thanks, Mario. So these 4 caucuses are very active during the intersessional period. They're reviewing documents, they're reading reports, they're doing webinars, they're producing information, they're coordinating consultations. So being involved via these caucuses is a good way to be involved in the subsidiary body. There are also a lot of working groups, like Christian also said. The working group on Article 8J, for instance, is one of them. So if there's a specific issue that you're involved with and there's a working group for it, maybe you would decide to follow the working group during the intersessional period and be involved in their meetings and their report writing and their drafting, etc. There are also, as Christian also mentioned, the Secretariat produces a plethora of reports. So many that I think none of us would ever read every single one of the reports produced, which is also brings me to say that participating in the CBD, usually the best way to do it is in a group. So for instance, the Global Youth Biodiversity Network, they organize how they'll respond to the notifications or reports, and they split up the work. So as one individual, you might not be able to do it all, but if you come together as a group, you usually have better success at it. These are another slide to just reinforce these 4 major interest groups, which I think are a really good avenue for initial involvement, at least in the CBD. The International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity. We can share a link to how to join their listserv so you can keep up to date with what is coming out of the IIFB. The Global Biodiversity Youth Network, which if you're here, it's probably because you're familiar with it. And again, I think GYBN has a listserv, which you can also be part of, and they have webinars and a series of events. The CBD Women and the Women's Caucus, they also have a listserv. They also have a constant communication and drafting events and parties, not parties, but drafting events, drafting parties. And then the CBD Alliance, which is also very active, and they host a lot of webinars and preparatory meetings and debriefs and et cetera, et cetera. So just to emphasize that. But for me, what's really interesting, and I think where the future of the convention really lies, is Christian highlighted one of the deficiencies and challenges of the CBD process is that what usually happens is governments get together, negotiate, make these decisions, but then they aren't necessarily always based on the ground reality. And so participating at the national and regional level sometimes is the best way for transformative change, to cause change within the CBD. And there are various ways to participate at the national and regional level. There are regional consultations. These are usually organized based in these 5 UN regional groupings: the Africa one, the Asia one, Central and Eastern Europe, Latin America, Western Europe, and others. So the CBD the Secretariat usually sends out a notification for these regional consultations. And if you're in that region, you are usually fine to participate. There is an accreditation process that we'll talk about tomorrow. So we won't get into that at the moment, but it's something to keep in mind about how you can gain access to participate. Something that Christian mentioned, which I think is one of the key parts or tools of the CBD, is these National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plans, which are called NBSAPs or NBSAPs. And the NBSAPs are the crux of how the convention is implemented. And for them to be developed, there usually is a series of national level consultations, national level reviews, national level drafting. And if you get in touch with your focal point, which I'll talk about in a moment, then you can usually participate in the NBSAP process. For the NBSAPs, there's always monitoring and review. So these have to constantly be monitored. And sometimes as an Indigenous person or an individual, you can participate in the review and monitoring of how well this is being implemented in your country. And NBSAPs, governments also produce a series of reports on NBSAPs on the progress of how they're being implemented. And these are usually publicly available. So it's always worthwhile reading the one for your country and understanding some of the priorities and where it goes and some of the opportunities for being engaged. And again, the opportunity for participating in an NBSAP is very real. And that's where a lot of our members from the ICCA Consortium participate. And I think a lot of youth also do. Just a note that these reports are publicly available on the CBD website. So I put a link there, but we put it in the chat and we're circulated in documents also. Now, for the way that CBD is organized, every government nominates a representative to the CBD. And these the CBD calls national focal points. I always recommend as a first step to go to the CBD website and look up who are the national focal points in your country. And sometimes you actually know these people. And if you don't know them personally, oftentimes someone in your network does. And so being in touch with your national focal point, being aware of who they are is a great first step for being involved in the CBD. An introductory email can be made. You can just introduce yourself or have someone introduce you if you have someone in common, and tell them what your areas of work are, what your priorities are, and ask them how you can be engaged. So that's always useful. Not all the national focal points respond, but having emailed them, if you then see them at the CBD meeting, you can say, I emailed you a couple months ago about this. Do you have a moment to chat? Or it's a good entry point with the national focal points. There are also a series of webinars and meetings at the national level. These are often coordinated by the Ministry of Environment in a specific country, but oftentimes they're coordinated by civil society or other NGOs. But it's always following up, if there is a Ministry of the Environment or a biodiversity section of the government or protected area part of the government, looking on their webpage and seeing what kinds of webinars and meetings they offer at the national level, especially tied to NBSAPs or other work of the CBD, is always worthwhile. And then it's always useful in my mind to look at partners at the national level, to scope out what your priorities are and then identify, oh, well, who would be also a good partner on this specific issue? So if it's protected areas or ICCAs or agriculture or water, whatever the topic is, you can map out which partners are active at the national level in the CBD and reach out to them. And then we will speak more to this tomorrow. So I only wanted to flag this here as an important thing to keep in mind. Christian mentioned that we're in the process, the CBD is in the process of developing the next 10-year strategy, which they're calling the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. And for the development of that framework, there is a process. We will get into that specific part of the process tomorrow through CEFA, and also about where we are in the post-2020 process with a presentation tomorrow. But I did want to flag this as being one of the key opportunities right now for engaging with the CBD. Again, this is setting up the stage for day 3 of our orientation tomorrow. So I think that is all. That was this last slide for me. So thank you, Cefa. Thank you, everyone. And I think we have time for questions, but if we don't, you can always put them in the chat and we will answer them. If we aren't able to answer them right away, we will as soon as we can.
Thank you so much, Ameyali. That was also really helpful, I think, for everyone here to just know those very concrete steps on how we can actually engage with the CBD. And we can discuss about this more in later on also, because it also differs by organization, by network, by caucus. So yeah, we can talk about that more later. Up next, we have a sharing session actually from some of the participants in our group. We have 4 people lined up. I hope they're kind of ready to share just like short bits of their experience. So we have Ursula from GYBN Mexico. We have Albert from the ICCA Consortium. We have Bright from GYBN Thailand, and we have Chailab from ICCA Consortium in Nepal. So just saying this so that they're ready. Amit, do you want to add anything before we proceed with our mini panel for today?
No, I think just happy to proceed. For us, this is a really great opportunity to learn from each other. So we're inviting them to share their experiences for that specific purpose. So go ahead, Cefa.
Okay, let me just check. Ursula, are you here? Okay. Our question.
Sí, hola, buenos días. Bueno, tardes y noches.
Okay.
No, primero me gustaría comenzar diciendo que hay que aceptar que la incidencia política de las juventudes es un reto. Es un reto por el hecho de sentir.
Un momento, por favor.
I'm so sorry. So what we are asking Ursula to share is her experience in national advocacy. We know that our chapter in Mexico has done a lot of great work in influencing or at least participating in their government processes on the CBD. So Ursula is the coordinator of GYBN Mexico, and she will share briefly about how they advocate at the national level. So go ahead, Ursula. Thank you.
Sí, hemos participado en el análisis y sobre todo en el posicionamiento de algunas iniciativas y reformas de leyes, como la Ley General de Desarrollo Forestal Sustentable y la Ley General sobre Biodiversidad en el 2017. En estos procesos se desarrollaron conversatorios en donde pues ayudó a comprender cuáles eran los puntos en que se tenía que tomar en cuenta y qué pensaban las juventudes al respecto, sobre todo GYBN de México, y a partir de eso, pues dar el posicionamiento de GYBN México a las instituciones, ¿no? También el año pasado realizamos la consulta de jóvenes de México por la biodiversidad, en donde además de recopilar la opinión de las juventudes en México, también tuvimos un diálogo intergeneracional con algunas instituciones gubernamentales en donde dimos a conocer estos resultados y también dimos a conocer el posicionamiento que tiene México. Y también hemos estado trabajando a mediados del año pasado sobre igual divulgación, y también se realizó por parte del equipo de GYBN México un análisis de un manifiesto de impacto ambiental de un megaproyecto llamado Tren Maya acá en México, en donde a partir del análisis que se realizó por parte del equipo se hizo un posicionamiento, y bueno, a partir de eso pues estamos creando algunas estrategias para dar a conocer lo que se encontró dentro del análisis, y también pues crear alianzas con otras redes de jóvenes y con otros jóvenes independientes para que tome fuerza esta parte, ¿no? Y bueno, y pues por el momento pues también estamos generando algunas estrategias para llamar a más jóvenes a que participen en esta parte de incidencia política, a que se informen y que también puedan y tengan las herramientas necesarias para generar coaliciones, porque sabemos que una parte importante de la incidencia política es generar estos grupos de apoyos, estas coaliciones entre los jóvenes para poder incidir de una manera más efectiva, ¿no? Y bueno, hasta ahora mi participación.
Thank you, Ursula. Very, very helpful to hear how GYBN Mexico prepared for the CBD and does their consultations. It's a very interesting process. I would like to introduce Albert to complement what you just shared. Albert is Maya from the municipality of Sanahat in Mexican Yucatan. He is actively engaged with the Interdisciplinary Center for Research and Alternative Development. The center is a home to a group of dedicated indigenous young people who combine science and traditional knowledge. Albert is also our Mesoamerican coordinator for the ICCA Consortium, and he's agreed to share with you today on why is it important, Albert, for your community, or why do you think it's important for your community to participate in the CBD? Adelante, Albert.
Hola, buenos días. Muchas gracias, Ame. Efectivamente, aquí estamos trabajando en nuestra comunidad, y aquí me gustaría retomar algo que mencionaste en tu presentación, la importancia de las redes. Como comunidad pequeña, es muy difícil tener incidencia en otros espacios, desde espacios nacionales hasta espacios muy grandes como el que acabamos de ver, que es el Convenio de Diversidad Biológica, los foros del Convenio de Diversidad Biológica. Y aunque vemos que sí es muy importante lograr tener participación en estos espacios. ¿Por qué es importante? Porque desde nuestras comunidades estamos viendo que se están tomando decisiones a nombre nuestro sin participación nuestra. Y esa es la clave de por qué tenemos que participar. Ahora que hemos leído o revisado los reportes del IPBES del 2019, cada vez hay más reconocimiento de la importancia del papel que jugamos los pueblos indígenas en la conservación de nuestros recursos naturales. No es a partir de ese reconocimiento que estamos conservando, es lo que de por sí venimos haciendo. Esto resulta también en que hemos escuchado que hay muchos recursos que se van a destinar o que se están destinando para la conservación. También en este nuevo plan post-2020 se está hablando de incrementar la superficie de conservación. Y claro, nosotros nos preguntamos en qué superficie se van a poner más, se van a seguir conservando si nosotros somos los que somos dueños de esos territorios, ¿no? Entonces, esa es la razón por la que nos parece importante participar. ¿Y cuál es la forma en la que lo podemos hacer? Bueno, pensamos que es a través de las redes que ya existen. Una de estas es la red global del consorcio TICA, que es una de las formas como nosotros estamos participando. Nuestra primera participación fue en la COP de Cancún, que no pudo haber otra forma sino es a través del consorcio, en la que hubo oportunidad de que otras comunidades de México fuéramos a través del consorcio TICA. Y bueno, dándonos cuenta de esta importancia es que en México empezamos a consolidar la red de territorios de vida o la red TICA en nuestro propio país. Y cada vez estamos más avanzando más y estamos justamente ahora planeando cómo vamos a incidir en los diferentes ámbitos, desde nacionales hasta la posibilidad de participar de nuevo en la próxima COP para estos nuevos planes. Eso es básicamente. Muchas gracias.
Excelente, Albert. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you so much, Albert, for sharing that very valuable experience. Indeed, it's very important for communities to participate, and for many, they have seen the value of engaging with their government. Although this situation is, of course, diverse in different situations and different countries. So next on our panel, we thought you would like to hear from someone who just recently attended a meeting for the first time from the youth community. So we have here Bright, who is the chapter coordinator for GYBN Thailand. He is also an ASEAN Youth Biodiversity Leader. And last year during OEWG 2 in Rome, he was supported by the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity to participate and go in person to the meeting. So Bright, can you share briefly, how was that experience for you?
Yes, thank you, Sefa. First, I would like to let everyone knows about a bit about my background first, because my background is not directly come from the biology or science background, but I came from the business and logistics management side, which is quite different from biology and conservation. But then I quite make a shift a little bit on my studies in the masters, and then come into like sustainability, and then I get into the work on something related to sustainable consumption and production and circular economy, and then I get to join the GYBN later on. So it's a very great experience on that. And later on,
Right, I'm
yes.
so sorry. Can you speak slowly so that the interpretation?
Oh,
okay.
yes, sorry. Yeah. So and then after I joined GYBN, I get an opportunity with uh, from the community and also from my work, who support me to further to work on something related to financing for biodiversity. So it's kind of an experience that's for me to establish the GYB in Thailand, and then I think it's a reason that allow me to be selected to join the OEWG too. And as I told you about my background, so I when I know that I get to join the OEBG. At first, I quite nervous because I didn't have such a background in biology before, and I don't know what to expect. Like, what should I be prepare myself for, or how much should I know about the biology or conservation stuff? So I'm quite nervous, but thank you very much to the GYBN community, and especially Mena, Christian, Sefa, and everyone who join us there, and Mika as well, who join us there at the OEWT, who give us a train for 2 days about like give us a brief about the background of what is CBD, what are the processes, what are the terms and conditions, what are roles that we can play. So it gives us like kind of empowerment and more confidence to take part in it. And I really love the words that it's okay to be lost, and it's actually lost, like for the whole week. It's a good loss though, because it's like a very like steep graph of learning. I get to learn about how the sections are designed, what's the structure of the conversation is, starting from plenary that every parties get to talk, and then everyone separated into groups discussing about each agenda on the zero draft, which is quite specific and very technical. And then our roles we are playing on that we are me as a youth participating for the first time. I get to like take lots of notes, simultaneous notes in English, whether even though I did I, I I wasn't born with English language, so it was very exciting, and it's a skill that I gained from that. And also the negotiating part, it's really give me an idea on what are the ongoing issues or emerging ones that I need to follow, so that I can take it back to make to share with my team in Thailand, and then maybe further deeper discussions and how we can take forward on that. And also the part that I'm really impressed, and my favorite part is that the intervention part, which as Kristen already said, that CBD is a unique one that civil society get to join and get to speak up, to voice out what should be like the important issues that should be raised. And we youth as one of the civil society, sorry, as one of the civil society, we get to give an intervention as well. And um, and and that's related to the notes, all the notes that we took as a team, that we take turns to take notes, and then there will be a team to gather all those notes to make interventions, uh, like at the end of every discussion group. So it's quite like a very hard work that the team has to prepare, and we have to be very like updated about the informations, and then deliver that message. And the last thing that I would like to mention is that we as young people, I can sense that we really give a unique sense, or unique atmosphere to the big conference, because we mentioned and try to make everyone, like to remind everyone that all those discussions, it will impact to the young people, to the next generations that they have to work for. And also, it's not just about the policy, but it's about how we are connected to the nature. And that's what we as young people can highlight it, can very well at the meeting. And all those experience are really great. And I think it's something that we can take forward and back to our country to design how we as young people can participate in the political process at the national level, and create big impact forward at our community. Yeah, thank you. Hope it's not too fast.
It was brief, but it's okay.
Yes,
um,
sorry.
don't worry. No, don't worry. Thank you so much for sharing. And there were a couple of points to take away from that. One is that preparation is key. And this is one way that we are preparing you guys for your participation in the coming weeks in the Substa and SPI sessions. So we hope this helps with that. And also that it's okay to be lost. It's really normal. No one gets this on the first try because it is a very complex process. And mostly in terms of policy, we learn by doing. So yeah. Ameyali, take it away.
Yes, thank you, Bright. I think lost is still how I feel at every CBD meeting. So it means you're on the right path. I think what you said in terms of being there and the preparatory work and how the team comes together to draft the statements and filter the information and then present it, I think it is definitely a process. And I think being lost is just part of it. And as you become more and more familiar, the feeling lost doesn't go away. So you're right there, right? So next, I would love to introduce Jailab. Jailab is from Nepal. He's part of the Forest Action Network. He's also the coordinator of the ICCA Consortium network in Nepal. And Jailab has been doing amazing work, not just supporting Indigenous peoples in Nepal, but also supporting Indigenous youth, which I think is really important for the coming years of what the CBD is doing. And where we need to move for the CBD and for biodiversity in general. So Jailab attended for the first time ever the working group meetings in Rome also. And I would love to ask you, Jailab, was it useful? Was attending those meetings in Rome useful for you and for your community? If you could share that information with us, that would be wonderful.
Well, thank you, Amy, for giving me this chance to share my experience, my learning from the working group in Rome last year. In fact, by profession, I am the teacher. I used to teach in the university. I taught a lot of students in my discipline, but I rarely thought of working with the youths. Fortunately, I became able. I was invited to participate in the CBD working group in Rome last year. So let me share 2 blocks of my experiences. The first, my experiences, my learning from the participation in Rome last year in February. And second is back to my home, what I'm doing, what I changed my perspectives, my thinking, and what I started back to Nepal. So let me share the first part of my experience. Last year, I'm very happy to see Shefa, Melina, also Bright, and Christians. We were together in Rome last year. So I was very much impressed by the way the youths, like Shefa, Christian, Melina, contributed to the whole working group process in the Rome. So that was quite very amazing for me. So that was one of the very interesting, very important inspiration for me in my life. So there, despite of the youth's contribution to the CBD working group process, I mostly participated in the IIFE group that Christian already said about it. So the IIFE group's working process was quite interesting for me because every points, every targets, the IIFE groups work very intensively, discuss very intensively. And one of the very interesting thing for me is that the diverse people from across the world were in the same room. We were in the same room, same table, and discussed very in depth from own perspectives, own experiences, from own countries, own communities. For example, many of the colleagues were from Finland, many of the colleagues were from South America, North America, Africa, Asian countries. So I learned a lot from the IIFB team, the members. For example, most of the technical coordinations were done by Sefa and some other colleagues from Philippines. So that was very amazing for me, that how the youths were very active, not only in the youth, but also in the IFB groups. So that was the internal discussions on the points, experience sharing among the groups, and translating their own experiences into the text was quite amazing for me, quite inspiring for me. Similarly, the process of lobbying with the decision makers, that was another part of my learning. I mean, every group were very curious to influence, curious to communicate own experiences to the policymakers, decision makers, and also the plenary, contributing in the plenary, statement sharing, or telling own statements from different perspectives, different groups. For example, youth groups, IFB groups. So that were very interesting for me. That was very amazing for me, that how we, the people, indigenous people, can share, can contribute to the whole CBD process. Was quite interesting, quite amazing, quite very thought-provoking for me. I mean, so based on this kinds of whole processes that I learned from the working groups in Italy last year, so I realized that the indigenous peoples, indigenous leaders across the world are very powerful. The youths across the world are very powerful to influence the policymakers, decision makers. So that was very interesting perspectives, interesting experiences on me from the Rome. And after back to my country, Nepal, I realized that, I mean, I was working with the ICCA leaders, community leaders since last 10 years, from the very beginning of the ICCA establishment. But after the participation in Rome, I realized that working with youth is most important, because they are the change maker. They can change the leaders. They can influence the policymakers. So then I started communicating. I started preparing some mindsets, some of the plans, how to start working with the youths, how to connect with the youths. So, but unfortunately, when I back to Nepal, the Nepal also, the lockdown started in Nepal, and only since last 2 months, some normal life is happening. I mean, the lockdown continued more than 8-9 months in Nepal, so I could not do much more as I thought in Rome, after Rome. However, within the last 3-4 months, I started connecting the youths through the online meetings, Facebook Messenger group discussions, and so on. So after back to Nepal, I want to say 3 things. The one important thing that I realize is the indigenous people in Nepal are very weak in terms of influencing the policymakers in Nepal. So there are a lot of indigenous people. I mean, I also told you yesterday that more than 80 ethnic indigenous nationalities are in Nepal, and about 40% of the national population are covered by the indigenous people. Though indigenous people's contributions, say, or influence in the CBD process is very weak. I realize that, because almost all of the policymakers in Nepal are non-indigenous. They neither realize the importance of indigenous people's participation in the policymaking process, nor they realize the importance of recognizing the indigenous people's customary laws, practices, their culture, and things like that. So that's one point I realized. And second point I realized is that the youths can be the change makers in this context. So I am recently thinking of and trying my best to connect the different indigenous communities, particularly prioritizing the youths. But the problem is in Nepal, the internet is very poor. There is no internet in most of the remote areas, almost all of the remote areas, and indigenous people are in remote areas, villages, where there is no internet services. So I'm trying my best to encourage the youths and bring the youths, those who are in the internet services, like in city areas for their studies, like in capital cities and other city areas. So I have become already able to communicate and form different groups, more than 10 indigenous groups in Nepal, those who are the members of the ICCA Network Nepal. So I guess more than 100 youths are already in contact with me. So I am sharing different forms of what is the ICCA, what is the role of the ICCA, how can we influence the policymakers, how they themselves can self-strengthen in terms of the ICCAs, in terms of the nature, culture, conservation, so things like that. I mean, coming back to Nepal, these sort of things are very enlightening for me. And also the Christians, today's presentation also made me very clear about what CBD is and how CBD takes place. Though I participated in CBD COP in Hyderabad a few years back in 11th CBD COP, but that was quite complicated for me to understand as being first participant there. But after participating in the room last year, and also today's Christian's and Sefa's presentation made me much more clear about what CBD is, how CBD goes on. So, I mean, reflecting from the Italy Rome last year, I think many of the youths in Nepal can have some sort of contributions, will have some sort of contribution to the whole CBD processes, and also have good contact with the focal point of the CBD in Nepal. But unfortunately, the focal point recently was changed to the another department, and new focal point is, I don't know new focal point, but I have to know him and I have to meet him and have some sort of collaboration and knowledge sharing, and also take the CBD and ICCA Network Nepal and the ICCA Youth Group to the CBD focal point. I guess I will be able to connect youths with the CBD focal point, and also the entire conservation agencies in Nepal, for example, WWF, Bird Conservation Nepal, Red Panda Network Nepal, IUCN, and NTNC. These kinds of international and national big organizations are there, and I have a kind of good relation with them, and I'm trying to my best to connect the youth with this all of the conservation agencies in Nepal. So so there are a lot of things to share, but I tried my best to reflect my experience from the Rome last year and the things I'm currently initiating. So thank you so much for this opportunity to share my learning from the Rome participation last year. Thank you, Ameyali.
Thank you, Jaila. Very, very useful to know. And I think something that both you and Albert mentioned was the issue of representation, which is always a challenge. It's not just about showing up, it's about how do we connect, how do we reach out to those people who don't have internet, who are going to be most affected by the decisions of the CBD, and get them a seat at the table, which I think is something that we definitely need to work on, and we actively work on, at least on behalf of the ICCA Consortium, and I know GYBN does too. So thank you for that. I know we are 5 minutes after time. We would love the opportunity to touch base, albeit briefly, in breakout groups. So if you need to leave, we understand, but if you are able to stick around, we're going to break out into 2 groups, one for the ICCA Consortium and one for GYBN. So just stick around. I think Mario is going to send us all to the breakout groups now, and we'll conclude the day there today. So just wait one moment while Mario gets us organized into the breakout rooms.